Let me just begin, open this conversation by saying that the framework agreement, and so is the Annex on wealth sharing, is actually an embodiment of a shared vision of what the government and the MILF think should be the situation in the Bangsamoro areas, okay? And this comes from their agreement, at which they put in writing first in April of 2012, that the status quo is unacceptable. So the way to approach these documents is that you always go back to the status quo. And therefore, if you read the framework agreement, if you read the annex, it always opens with an assumption, with a statement of what the parties think is the status quo. And this status quo, which is supposedly unacceptable, has many dimensions. So there is a political dimension to it, there are security dimensions to it, human rights, justice issues. But today, we're going to look at the fiscal dimension of this unacceptable status quo. According to the parties, this is a common observation. The areas, first of all, covered by the Bangsamoro territory, and this territory is mentioned in the framework agreement, most of these areas are actually the most underdeveloped in the country. And we are talking about Maguindanao, Lanao del Sur, Basilan, Sulu, Tawi-Tawi, and some barangays and municipalities in North Cotabato and in Lanao del Norte. So that is the focus of the annex, okay? And according to them, these areas are not just underdeveloped, but even, for example, you talk about revenues, even if you look at the revenues generated in these areas, the revenues generated have not been enough to provide for the expenses of the regional government. So moving from this vision of the status quo, the parties agreed that therefore, one way out of this situation is to give the regional government, now the new autonomous political entity, which is called the Bangsamoro, more powers on fiscal matters. And therefore, in the annex, you will find the phrase, the highest form of fiscal autonomy. So first, they're going to give the Bangsamoro more powers, more taxing powers. More taxing powers, that means that the scope of regional taxes that the Bangsamoro government may impose have now been expanded. But in what way? Basically, they added four taxes, which were originally imposed by the national government, but now are going to be imposed by the regional government. They're also giving the Bangsamoro more shares in national taxes. So in the status quo, the ARMM actually gets 70%. It gets a 70% share in taxes imposed by the national government, 70%. Okay, so 70% is split between the regional government and the provinces or the cities concerned. So at present, it's 35% to the region and 35% to the province or the cities in national taxes. What the annex has done is to actually increase the sharing formula. So now it's 75% to the Bangsamoro, 25% goes to the national taxes. Another aspect of the status quo is that LGUs outside the ARMM actually get 40% share in the national taxes. These are LGUs outside. For example, Davao City gets a share 40% in the national taxes. But for LGUs inside the ARMM, under the current setup, it's only 35%, right? So they're actually disadvantaged by 5%. So hopefully, the additional 5% in the share of the Bangsamoro hopefully would go to the LGUs. Now, so more share, more regional taxes, more share in the national taxes, but they also get more share in taxes, fees, and charges imposed by the national government. So national fees and charges. Before it was also 70-30, now it is 75-25 in favor of the Bangsamoro. So now the Bangsamoro should get 75% in fees and charges imposed by the national government. What does this mean? We will see this in relation to power sharing. So fees and charges are different from taxes. Fees and charges are, for example, if you go to the LTO and you apply for a license and you pay certain fees. or you go to the register of deeds and you want a certain parcel of land registered, then you pay certain fees. There are fees that are imposed by the national government. The Bangsamoro will get a share 75%. However, for fees and charges imposed by the regional government, all of that will go to the Bangsamoro. Aside from this, there is also now for the Bangsamoro more shares in income derived from natural resources. There is also a significant departure from the status quo when it comes to this. First of all, the Annex mentions shares in government income. In the status quo, there's no such use of the word. If you look at Republic Act 9054, what it actually says is shares in national revenue or taxes derived from natural resources. So it's taxes. What's the difference when you say income and taxes? Annex says more shares in income derived from natural resources. Now, even in the income, the Bangsamoro will also have a share. That is one significant departure. So there's a share in the taxes, there's also a share in the income. Second departure is that before, and this has been a problem in the ARMM, there is a category called strategic minerals. And it has resulted in several inequitable dealings between the regional government and the national government. So what are these strategic minerals? In 9054, there is the general rule is that the regional government, the ARMM, will have the power over management, exploration, development, utilization of natural resources. That's the general rule. And then the law says, except strategic minerals, such as, okay, and then it goes on, petroleum, fossil fuel, coal, natural gas, uranium, etc. So, and it doesn't say, it is not exactly an exclusive list. It says, such as though it is enumerating examples. Okay, and this has resulted in many problems. In the Annex on Wealth Sharing, this category of strategic minerals is no longer there. So now, they limited themselves to clearer categories. I would say clearer categories. First, they consider non-metallic minerals, metallic minerals, and fossil fuels and uranium. Okay, so, and these are the categories that they use now when they talk about sharing over income, sharing in income over natural resources. So if it is a non-metallic mineral, such as gravel, sand, or quarry, then 100% goes to the Bangsamoro. If it is a metallic mineral, that's 75% to the Bangsamoro and 25% to the national government. If it's fossil fuel or uranium, then that's 50-50 sharing between the national and the Bangsamoro. So aside from this, and I think that this is according to the government panel, the crowning jewel of the Annex on Wealth Sharing. This is the agreement that the Bangsamoro government will have annual block grants or fund transfers from the central government. What are block grants? Essentially, this is money coming from the national government, which is automatically released, automatically appropriated, and regularly released to the Bangsamoro. Why is this important? In the status quo, there's no such mechanism called block grants, which is automatically and regularly released. At present, what we have, what the ARM has, is a line item appropriation in the national budget, in the GAA. So, for example, because it's a line item there, the regional government every year goes to Congress, explains its expenditures, and actually has to justify every item in its expenditure so that its budget can be approved. It's treated just like, for example, OPAP or DPWH or DBM, as though it were a line agency. So every year it goes there, regional governor explains to your national politicians, that this is what we need for the region. And many comment that this actually impinges on the political autonomy of the region. So now the MALF has pushed that the budget, that the transfer, the budget of the regional government should be automatically appropriated and regularly released. Subject, of course, to a regional budget and audits from the national government. Of course, the jurisdiction of the COA is not in any way diminished in the framework agreement or in the annex. So the region will continue to be within the jurisdiction of the COA. Another thing about the Annex on Wealth Sharing is that it has been glaringly silent on the issue of indigenous communities, especially the interests of indigenous communities on natural resources. While I agree that this is lamentable, I think that having been part of the negotiations before, I think that there is a reason for this. And it's not to disregard or to ignore the fact that the indigenous communities have interests in natural resources, but mainly because the Annex on Wealth Sharing, if you read it carefully, is really focusing on the relationship between the national government and the regional government. That's really the focus. However, if you will wait for the Annex on Power Sharing, the management, exploration, development, utilization of natural resources, the issue of ancestral domain and ancestral lands will all come out in that annex. Another important thing, I suppose, in the Annex on Wealth Sharing is this provision on, the phrase will not appear there, but I would see it as like a principle of progressive realization of full fiscal autonomy. Progressive realization, as I say, will not appear there, but I'm using a term that appears in the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. You see in our UN instruments, there are many rights that are being pushed, okay, depending on the instrument. And however, as we push for certain rights, there is fear that as we try to capture rights and duties and obligations in language, there is fear that we might overlook some of those which we have gained in previous instruments or in past documents. So we don't move back. As we try to keep looking for ways to move forward and to achieve full fiscal autonomy, as we try to negotiate and as we try to come up with new laws and new national or regional laws, let's try to maintain all those that we have gained in the past. So it's progressively realized fiscal autonomy. And this is a good, I think this is a good provision. This is an opening for future generations to negotiate for more. And that's another thing that's good with the Annex. It provides for several intergovernmental mechanisms. It recognizes that even as you try to allocate, this is regional tax, this is a regional tax, this is a national tax, this is a regional power and national power, ultimately some conflict will arise. Whether a matter should be properly within the area of the regional government or within the jurisdiction of the central government. With a recognition that in the future, a better scenario might be imagined, might be possible, and therefore you need a venue through which the region and the central government will continue to negotiate more powers, will continue to settle their differences. Okay. And this is something that is clearly lacking in the status quo. So one thing that is good about having such a mechanism is that you won't have to go to court every time that the regional government has an issue with the central government. I would like to raise this example. Recently, you know that some lawyers went to the Supreme Court saying that the national RH law should not apply to the ARMM because according to them, it violates the autonomy of the regional government on health and education, which they say have been exclusively devolved, absolutely devolved to the regional government. So no venue to negotiate this, and so this group of lawyers went to the Supreme Court. But interestingly, the Supreme Court asked these lawyers, what is the position of the regional government on this? And they say that they don't know. They never asked. So anyway, you see, in anticipation of such situations, very important that we have intergovernmental mechanisms. So you see that the Annex actually attempts to cause substantive institutional or structural changes. But I suppose the question that we might be asking is, how much impact would it have on behavioral changes in the Bangsamoro, whether it is on the part of the politicians or the electorate? And that is a question that, of course, the Annex hasn't settled. It is a question for all of us to think about, especially for the civil society groups. Earlier, I mentioned that one of the problems in the status quo is that there is a wide gap between the needs of the running a government, a regional government, and the revenues that they have to fund those expenses. But aside from this being due to the limited tax base in the region, we all know that the reason for this is that there is another leak in the system. And that leak is, of course, in the form of corruption. And of course, the Annex provides for an auditing body for principles of transparency and again, the intergovernmental mechanisms. But then what structural issues, perhaps, does the Annex make available so that we can address this particular problem? And at this point, I would like to relate this with what we know, the pork barrel problem that we have at the moment. Well, first of all, pork is haram. So I mean, it's a kind of pork barrel. Yes, but okay. So the nature of a pork barrel, I think we all know, it's a vestige of patronage politics. It's a spoil. It's essentially a dole out. For the Bangsamoro, first of all, what we know that the government in the Bangsamoro is going to be parliamentary in form. Ministerial is what is used in the framework agreement, but what we really mean is parliamentary. And the reason for this is there has been a strong position on the side of the MILF that there should be a clear delineation of roles between the executive and the legislature. In our current constitutional setup, our constitution is actually quite modern, considering. But it is placed in the context that is not quite, perhaps ready to explore the maximum extent of the modernity and the democracy that is already embedded in the Constitution. The Constitution is clear about the role of Congress. It's supposed to write laws. When it comes to money, yes, it has the power of the purse, but it's supposed to review policy, budget proposals on the part of executive. It's not supposed to disburse money. It's supposed to debate policy proposals and budget proposals and consider their policy implications. That's the role of Congress when it comes to money. So there seems to result a certain case of conflict of interest. Can you imagine? You're the one who's approving the budget, but you also intend to spend a part of it. For the Bangsamoro, we intend to maximize the possibilities for a parliamentary form of government. In the parliamentary form of a government, we really intend to strengthen a platform-oriented political party system. So try to depart from the personality-based politics, which is prevalent and which actually is part of this cycle that the pork barrel is also a part of. Okay, just to close, my reflections on the Annex on Wealth Sharing, I think that no matter how many or how radical the structural change might be, on the part of the public, on the part of the electorate, there has to be some shift or a paradigm shift in our expectations of our elected officials. And I think that this goes into the heart of the PDAF issue. I mean, the congressmen say, if you're going to abolish the pork barrel, might as well abolish Congress. Because they say, that is what our public expects of us. If that's true, then perhaps part of the problem is that, part of the solution rather, is that as the electorate, we should also change what we expect of the people we elect in office. Do we expect them to deliver goods? Or do we expect them to make sure that the services are there, that the mechanisms for the delivery of goods and these services are actually functioning? What do we expect of people in government? And so I think that that is also an important part of the problem in the Bangsamoro, which the Annex doesn't really address directly. So, thank you.